It's one of those weeks. All right, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
And
It's been a long week.
we'll get right into the Torah portion.
It's one of those weeks. All right, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
The Torah portion is Lekh Lekha. And I really just want to focus on Genesis 12:1, which is where we get the Lekh Lekha aspect of it, which it's translated so many different ways. It's interesting. It's almost like there's an intentional ambiguity in the commandment. But it says, now the Lord said to Avram, go forth, Lekh Lekha, from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And so it's a very explicit commandment. And you see there's three levels or three places from which he must go. It's two of those are where you need to leave from. And he says, if you will leave this place and this place, only then will I be able to show you where you're going to go. And if you've ever been in that place, and this is not to 100% of the time, but some of the time, have you ever felt like your spiritual life just kind of stalled out? And you say, what's my direction? Where am I supposed to be right now? Well, one thing you can do as you're going through that process of self-examination is say, okay, what's the last thing he told me to do? Did he tell me to leave this thing? Did he tell me to quit messing around with that? Did he tell myself to extract myself from this relationship or from this commitment? And probably until I have obeyed that commandment, then he may not show me exactly where I'm going next. He's waiting on me, or in this case, Avram. He says, you need to leave your country, which was Ur of the Chaldees. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And from your relatives. Sometimes you can leave the place where you live, but you're still very much attached to relatives. In this case, the Midrash tells us that Avram actually had relatives who were plotting to kill him because he was causing them so much trouble in the religious community. And you didn't separate the religious community from any other sort of community. Back in Avram's day, it was all the same thing. And we know that his father Terah was an alleged idol maker. And so he's still in a household of idol makers and idol worshipers. Now, there's some irony because if Terah made the idols, he had to have known they didn't work. Because he made them. And some of the stories they tell of Avram confronting his father, making up stories about what the idols did to one another when he wasn't looking. It's really hilarious, but it makes a point, and it teaches us a point that they only have the power that we attribute to them. They're drawing the power from us. They have no inherent power in themselves. So he says, you need to leave this place. You need to leave your father's household. And we know he didn't leave that household for good. In later generations, he would go back to his father's household to find a wife for Isaac. And we know that Jacob would even go back to that place. And so sometimes it might seem like you're being separated from your family or your clan for a little while. It doesn't mean that you won't go back and there won't be a different relationship in the future. So he does. He needs to leave these places before he can find the promised land, so to speak. And it's that verse there is kind of a backward forward verse in terms of where you are in the narrative, but that verse really incorporates something in the past, something in the present, and then something in the future. I love verses like that where it really, in one statement, it ties you to things that have already happened to you, things that are happening to you, and the good things that will happen to you if you'll keep moving. Now, where was Ur? We know he was told to leave Ur, which at this point in the narrative, he already left. He'd already left Ur. Here's what's funny. He was in Ur. When he was told, Lekh Lekha, we said, well, he's already left Ur the Chaldees. Yes, he did. But he might have been in a different Ur. And it just takes a little historical investigation to figure out what might be going on. Because traditionally, most scholars are going to agree that ancient Mesopotamian Ur, or at least the Ur of Avram, was going to be found about 140 miles southeast of Babylon and about 10 miles west of the present bed of the Euphrates River. And they say in antiquity, the river ran much closer to the city, and that the change of course has altered the landscape quite a bit. And I put there a program you could actually pull up on the Smithsonian Channel Plus. Please don't believe everything in the script, because they've managed to fuse two time periods hundreds of years apart. And I'm like, I don't know how you do that unless you're just not really reading. But they're confusing Nebuchadnezzar II, I think, with the Tower of Bavel and Nimrod, and we're going to separate that out so you won't be confused. But there's that Ur, and you can also just type it in a plain old Google search on the Google Maps. When you pull up Ur on the Google Maps, there's a little picture icon in the upper left-hand corner. If you just click on the picture of Ur, it'll open up a slideshow for you, and you can see pictures of it. And this is a picture of the ziggurat that's still in Ur of the Chaldees. It's the bottom level, but you can see the basic design of it. And it would have gone up set into 7 sections. The top section would have been the temple area. So you can even see they're trying to replicate the 7 heavens here. And the reason that it's going to make sense later why King Nebuchadnezzar is so concerned about a stone hitting his image is because there aren't any foundation stones. There's small stones. If you look at the picture, you can see, well, there's little rocks, but I don't see anything capable of holding up a big building. And you're right. And that's why in the description of the building of the Tower of Bavel, they go into great detail about how they're going to have to make these mud bricks, because that's the only thing they can do. And it's going to be up to the mud bricks to bear the foundation. And as the program I was telling you about, they'll talk to engineers who will tell you how impossible it is for the structure to bear the weight unless they do it exactly this way, this sort of 7-stepped moving inward. That's the only way you can disperse the weight where it won't just collapse without the big foundation stones like, say, you see in Jerusalem. They've got huge stones for that. But they can look at this ziggurat in Ur, and they can pretty much know what the Tower of Bavel looked like. And you can also know what King Nebuchadnezzar's copy of this looked like. He tried to copy the Tower of Bavel. I know in the book of Daniel, we read about the huge image that Nebuchadnezzar II erected for everybody to worship. But if you go in the program, and I couldn't find a picture of the rock without a copyright infringement. So I left it out. You can go find it if you want to. But it shows the ziggurat where Nebuchadnezzar tried to replicate this tower, and then his image is standing up level with it. So it tells you how big he imagined himself to be, that he thought he could just penetrate up into the heavens with that golden head of his. And here's some maps and stuff. You can pull that up on your own sometimes. But I wanted to explain why it may be that scholars are arguing about where Ur is, when most of the evidence is going to place it south of Babylon. If we look at, let's see, where's, okay, I thought I had Haran up there, but modern Haran is in the extreme south of modern Turkey, just across the border of northern Syria. So that gives you a kind of a place marker, and it makes you wonder, like, okay, how is this an advantage? If he left Ur of the Chaldees, this is not putting him any closer to the promised land. It's just kind of like going off on a tangent here, literally. And we say, well, there's no advantage into going to Haran, leaving Ur to go to another place. But it tells us why specifically in Lekh Lekha, he has to say, okay, don't just leave Ur. I need you to leave your father's house, because Tirach established his house in Charran. But what we find if we start reading the history of Charran and its surrounding regions, there's some Turkish names in there and so forth. You have to kind of sift through it. But what you realize at times in history, this area around Charran was also referred to as Ur. And so it makes it really simple what Tirach did. It's telling us that there was moon goddess worship in ancient Ur of the Chaldees. And so a similar temple was established in Haran, the other Ur, to the moon god Sin. And the temple there was called the House of Rejoicing. And they believe that it may have started during a time of war when the priesthood that was fleeing Ur of the Chaldees, they fled in a time of war. They went to what was Haran, and the priesthood reestablished itself there, reestablished the moon worship. And therefore, it was just like today. You know, Nashville's called the Athens of the South. All right. So if you move your priesthood there and your refugees there from one Ur to one other place, you can see why it might come to be called Ur. And so Abraham has to also leave this other Ur. So it's, is it this Ur or is it that Ur? Yes. Here or there. Yes. And so he's still got to get away from the idol worship. And we believe that based on the Midrash, the reason Tirach took Avram there and the rest of his family was, number one, because he was an idol maker in Ur. So he would have been a professional moon god / goddess maker. And he would want to go where there was a market for his goods. He still had to make a living. And so to get Avram away from Nimrod, he picks up everybody and, just like the fleeing priest, moves to a new Ur where he can continue creating or crafting his idols. And so this can be a little bit confusing if you're don't have a timeline right in front of you. This is one of those places where charts really do help instead of distract. And you can find them online. You probably find them in the back of your Bible. That's where I found one. Just found one in the back of the Bible. But the dispersion from the Tower of Babylon or Bavel occurred approximately 1996 from creation. And so Avram would have been about the age of 48 when the languages were confused at the Tower of Bavel. He would have watched, probably because the two cities were so closely connected with one another economically, religiously, and so forth. I'm sure that he's witnessed much of the building of this tower, especially if he's delivering idols. I mean, I don't know, before he had this separation with his father. But it said that the Tower of Bavel was under Nimrod's direction. And we get 3 mentions of Nimrod, and each one will tell us something that might seem casual in a translation, but it's much more powerful in a Hebrew, when you look at the Hebrew words, because it says that Nimrod began to be a mighty hunter before the Lord. Well, that's pretty weak. Before the Lord? Well, that can almost make you seem like he was doing a good job. But in the context, it's saying he's basically in the face of. He's right up in the Creator's face saying, watch this. Look how strong I am. And so it's under his direction, and we'll look at the reasons why, that Nimrod wanted to build this tower. Nimrod's going to be our second world leader. Who was the first world leader? At the creation? Elohim.
Yeah.
Elohim's the first world leader. And he puts Adam in the garden, not necessarily the whole world, but in the garden. But Nimrod fancied himself the second world leader. And there's textual evidence that suggests maybe he was. You know, how many of you have seen examples of pyramids or mounds, religious mounds? If you watch Discovery or Smithsonian, it's almost all around the world. You'll see cultures building pyramids, and some of them, especially in Central and South America, they're almost identical to these Mesopotamian ziggurats. And so they're crediting Nimrod with having the power to be able to collect the nations to build this tower. And they identify 3 different groups with 3 different motivations for wanting to participate in building the tower. But again, the funny lines out of the Midrash. We need to do a book just on the funny stuff out of the Midrash. But they credit, and when David wrote Psalm 55:9, he wrote, "Confuse, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I have seen violence and strife in the city." And they say the original speaker of that line was Avram. He would walk through the city and he would see the workers working on the tower, and that's the curse that he would pronounce upon them. Because by that time he had figured out there's only one creator. And so it makes sense, because once the confusion of the languages set in, can you imagine if you said, hand me a hammer, and somebody hands you a saw? Yeah. Or you say, move that ladder over there, and they move it over there. And bad things can happen. And I'm sure it led to a lot of quarreling. But here's our 3 mentions of Nimrod. Genesis 10:8, now Cush became the father of Nimrod. He became a mighty one in the earth. And then verse 9 says, he was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. And you can see there it's giving a little bit different emphasis, how like he's supplanting, or he at least trying to supplant the power of the Holy One. And then in 1 Chronicles 1:10, we get something else that we want to unpack here, because I think Tim might find it interesting. What's actually embedded in 1 Chronicles 1:10 when it says he began to be a mighty one in the earth. The word there that's translated began does not begin to describe everything that began means in Hebrew. And it's going to explain, I think, why Nebuchadnezzar too needed all the instruments in order to cause all the peoples of the world that had collected to fall down and worship his image. He had to have the instruments to accompany it. Okay, here's some maps and things. There's a picture, and this is up until recently. If you go to Charran in southern Turkey, they have preserved some of these, because it wasn't maybe up until a couple hundred years ago that they quit building these mud brick houses. Very smart, because they disperse the heat. It's so hot, it's like over 100 degrees in the summertime, and these mud bricks would disperse the heat. But it shows you they've got the same building practices of where we're talking about, where Abraham came from. So here's back to the Midrash, and I call these our grain of salt clues, because we know the source of them. It's not in scripture itself, but sometimes they're working on scriptural clues. So we'll acknowledge this before we start unpacking the scripture themselves. They say that the reason Nimrod became so powerful was that Ham stole Adam's garments from Noah. I don't know if it was while he was drunk or what happened, but at any rate, we know that they say Ham stole Adam's garments from Noah. And these were special garments that allowed him to subdue the animals, because remember, that was his commandment, subdue it, rule over it. And this allowed Nimrod, because it was handed down to him, to also subdue animals. So he gained this reputation as being a fearless and powerful hunter, when it was not really him. It was just the divine power that was in the garment. And that Midrash is there to teach us that no matter what we accomplish in this world, don't ever confuse it with your own talent and skill and whatever, intelligence and cunning. That's not where it came from. The only power you have is because of divine strength. whatever power he gives you. And when you fail to acknowledge that, then you become like Nimrod. You become like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. You're like in his face saying, I did this, when you didn't. They say that Nimrod waged war. Remember, you got Shem, Ham, and Yafet, the three brothers. They say Nimrod decided to wage war against the Yafetites, conquered them, and actually took the first of slaves. He was like the ancestor of slave takers. And his followers thought that was such a great thing that they crowned him as king. And so he began to claim divine power and demanded that human beings prostrate themselves to him. And that's how we see that he became the second world ruler. We even have similar language because when it says the nations had gathered at Bavel, we know the beginning or the Reshit of Nimrod's kingdom, that's where it was, the Reshit. So it's a mimicry, it's a mockery, it's a fake. It's usurping off of Bereshit in the beginning. And now we get Nimrod said, well, you know what? I can be in the beginning too. This is the beginning of my kingdom. But he was the first world ruler. And so the nations thought that was a great idea. And they gathered thinking that through the tower, they could prevent another flood. And they're separated into three groups. There was a group who thought, you know what, this is just a natural phenomenon, a flood. It's going to happen every so many years. It's bound to happen, just like a meteor is going to hit the earth eventually, or it's nothing unusual. We don't need to attribute it to God or anything else. It's just a natural occurrence. So all we need to do is build a tower high enough and then the floodwaters can't reach us. There was another group who had become idol worshipers under Nimrod's influence. And they're the ones who wanted that, make that temple on the top level to make a name for themselves. And then the third group is more explicit. What was being accomplished in that top level, in the seventh level? Exactly. They're trying to exert authority and dominion over the Garden of Eden. That's why they're building it up on those levels. Because if you look at where it sits, the Tigris and the Euphrates River, where do we first read about those two rivers? In the garden. We know the Euphrates or the Parat River was the source that comes from the upper garden, comes from the throne, and it waters the lower garden. And then it makes the heads, the authorities, that go into the other rivers. The river that ran the tightest around the tree of life was the Ezekiel or the Tigris. And so they, not by accident, situate this tower right there, which is foolish, but we often do the same thing. We think we can do something in the natural physical realm that's going to move things in the heavens. But, you know, our little kingdom is right now, whatever number of years we have on this earth, that's your little kingdom to figure out what you're going to do with it. And are you going to challenge heaven every day? Or are you going to await his plan? That's basically what it boils down to. Nimrod and his successors, world leaders, did not want to await the plan of salvation. It's a long plan, by the way. We're still sitting around waiting. Yeshua's like, here I am, not very long, I'll be back. And here we sit again. And so there are those who believe that, you know what, why wait for an everlasting kingdom and have to do what some other king tells me to do? Why can't I have my own everlasting kingdom? And so this third group wanted to set up an idol at that seventh level, put a sword in his hand, and show the God of creation that war is being declared against him. They literally wanted to go to war with heaven. And we say, well, that's foolish. Well, then why did Adonai say, well, there's really nothing they've set their heart to do that they can't do some damage? And so I'm sure they couldn't have upended Adonai as the king of creation, but they definitely could have caused damage to the plan, I believe, the ultimate plan of redemption. I'm going to skip through this right here. And here's the three punishments based on the three motivations for building the tower. Now, the picture to the left, that's, I believe, of a Central or South American pyramid to show you how close they are in terms of the way that they're built. And that might tell us what these other civilizations were after when they built these pyramids. They knew that there was a power they could tap into. I don't think they understood how they were simply tapping into a realm of death, because they were tapping into a realm of sin. You can't make war on the Holy One. But you see all sorts of twisted understandings. The ones who gathered, thinking, well, this is just a scientific thing. We'll build a tower. We'll crawl up to the top of the tower and the floodwaters can't reach us next time they happen. It says that these people were scattered back to every country from which they'd come from. Maybe it's true, maybe it isn't, but we definitely do see pyramids and mounds all over the world. The second group, it says, were those building an assembly house for idol worship. And what happened to them is they were confused in their languages. And they began wounding and killing one another because they misunderstood. If you've ever tried to put something together with someone else, and not only did you not communicate with your spouse on what these instructions said, maybe the instructions were originally in Chinese and somebody did a really poor job of translating from the Chinese. And then you add the extra step and the thing's probably going to get put together with extra parts or parts left out. One thing at a time. And so there was a lot of wounding and killing that went on, because if you're building a tower that high, you really need to communicate. And so that tells us again in the Midrash, it's teaching us a lesson. Why do you attend a house of worship? What's your motivation? Because if your motivation is not pure, it may be that you will begin wounding and killing one another. Still true. And we're getting a lesson right here on how the Midrash works. And then the third group that wanted to wage war against Hashem and penetrate into the heavens to take back the garden, it says they were transformed into monkeys, spirits, and demons. And I can't argue with that because I hate monkeys. Nothing personal, but yes, I do hate you if you're a monkey. Now, the gibbons, I can kind of be okay with because they stay up in the treetops. But monkeys that can get in your house and do things, no. But they said that's what Avram would do. As this tower's being built, Avram would walk by. He'd insult the idols. He'd insult the workers. And finally, he was brought to Nimrod, who tries to force Avram to bow to him and to worship the idols. And Avram taunted him by saying, you're not immortal, and you can't resurrect anyone from the dead. Now that rings true because we know Abraham is our father in faith because he believed in the resurrection of the dead. You see how wrong it would be to penetrate back into the garden when Yeshua didn't yet have the keys to death? You wouldn't want in there before Yeshua got the keys, because you would basically be introducing sin and death into a place of life, and you're not going to stay in there anyway. It's a self-illusion, I guess, delusion. He puts Avram in prison for 10 years, takes Avram back out. Avram still won't cooperate, still won't bow down and worship him, and still won't worship the idols. And so Nimrod says, I'll destroy you with fire. It says they used the kiln that they'd been using to build the tower, and they stoked it 5 amot high, which my math's not great. Maybe that's 8 feet high. And then the slaves, it says, Nimrod's slaves opened the door after they had thrown him in, thinking, oh, certainly he's dead. And it says, behold, Avram was moving around in the midst of the fire as in a palace garden, and angels were keeping him company. Only the ropes holding him were burned. And then when Nimrod ordered Avram to be removed, the flames sprang up and burned them alive. Is that story starting to sound familiar? Yeah. So back to Lekh Lekha. We're kind of doing what Lekh Lekha does. We're going backward and forward in time. We know that when Lot was kidnapped, that Avram, who at this point has become Abraham, he suits up his men of war. He's got a few hundred men, and he takes off after him. And it's the scriptures say he goes all the way as far as Dan. He pursues these kings, these 4 kings, as far as Dan. What's interesting is the 4 kings could have, from where they conquered the 5 kings in that valley, they could have crossed over the mountains of Moab and used another road to go north to Damascus and then hung a right over to Babylon. It would have been a little safer, especially if you were trying to create some distance between you and anybody who might pursue. Oddly, they go straight up the Jordan Valley toward Damascus. You say, well, why did they go that way? There might be an explanation, because if you look at an English translation, it'll call Nimrod a mighty hunter. But if you read a lot of the Jewish translations, they will say he was a trapper. He liked to entrap people. And so Abraham takes off, and he reaches the gates of Dan. Now, if you'll remember, this is one of the places where the northern tribes set up an alternate altar and began worshiping idols and changed the times and the seasons. And they say once Abraham reached that place, Adam remembers, he was there with us, he felt such grief because he was a prophet. And he knew that his descendants would worship idols in this place. And he was almost overcome with grief at this point. Like, what's the point? If I'm going to do all this work and lay all this foundation, have you parents ever felt like that? I'm laying all this foundation and, the kids just aren't listening to me. Well, Abraham is able to look down tens of generations and say, my kids are not going to look back at me and be inspired by my faith. What's the point? And persisting to even take Lot, who's not that faithful, he's righteous, but he's not that righteous. Why should I even persist? Why not just give up on the resurrection? And you persist because they won't all turn away. There will be those who don't. And so that momentary loss of courage in that particular place could have been by design. Nimrod may have lured him there on purpose to trap him. Maybe not because he knew that it was a significant place for Abraham's descendants, but because there is a place. I don't know how many of you have been to Banyas Falls versus how many of you have been to Caesarea Philippi, but you're right there. If you could see over the mountain, you would see this. And this is called Nimrod's Fortress. And it's such an advantageous spot strategically for that particular place, being able to look over toward Mount Hermon, Syria, Lebanon. If you can control this spot right here, you can protect it or you can wage war. It's that strategic because they're going to have to pass right there in front of you. You can see everybody coming. And so you can even see the remains today of the medieval period. They've just built on it in successive civilizations because it was so important. And apparently Nimrod was the first to hold that point, trying to lure Abraham to get in there so he could fall on him and kill him. And it says, and I don't understand military tactics at all, but I'm sure somebody who did know could stand up here on the fortress and understand why scripture says Abraham divided his forces at night. And that's how he took them. I think that would make a great little lesson in itself. Mm-hmm. So in close proximity to Nimrod's fortress, because it's so close to Dan, Tel Dan, those gates of Abraham that I was showing you on the picture, you're also not far away again from Luz. Remember where they moved Luz, and Luz represents the resurrection. Caesarea Philippi, which is known as the gates of hell. even the Banyas Falls, which is also the headwaters of the Galilee. So many important things right there in that one spot. So it was key for Nimrod to be able to lure Abraham in there, because if he could, maybe he could kill Abraham's belief in the resurrection and the one God of Abraham. Maybe he could overthrow that. Let's see, let's get through these. So like I said, the pictures I showed you of Ur, and you can just superimpose that onto Babel in terms of the picture in your head. Not a lot of great stones there to build a tower on. But when we think of King Nebuchadnezzar, remember he has this dream, and it's an image, and it's got a head of gold, it's got silver, it's got bronze, it's got iron, it's got clay. In other words, the strength of the metals or the value of the metals decreases as you go down the body of the image until you get to clay. However, that's where we have to be careful. Nimrod really is ancient, and his building the Tower of Bavel. Nebuchadnezzar II is going to be the exile of the Jewish people many hundreds of years later. But how many times, especially like with Hitler, did he not go after the relics of previous great emperors and empires, thinking he could tap into those powers? It's foolish. Maybe there's something to it. They just don't see that it never works in the end. But it's thought that Nebuchadnezzar was trying to tap into this vision of Nimrod as a world ruler. And that brings us back to who was luring Abraham in to Dan. Well, we're told in Genesis 14:1, it came about in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar. And then it goes on and it discusses the other 4 kings. They say that Amraphel, the king of Shinar, which is where the tower was also Nimrod. And they say this was Nimrod's last attempt to kill Abraham. And then, of course, Abraham prevails at this point. Because Abraham is what's standing between him and world domination. Abraham's belief in one God and the power of resurrection. And Abraham knows that the resurrection and this kingdom is not going to be built upon kingdoms of men and tyrants. It's going to destroy and sweep them away just like that. Daniel 2:35, if we skip up to King Nebuchadnezzar, his vision, it says, or his dream, it says the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed all at the same time. All the kingdoms at one time collapsed and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. But the stone, and we tend to think, well, stone's not that valuable. It's not like gold, silver, and bronze, iron. Something that we think is without value, a stone. It says the stone struck the statue, and it became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. That which has been rejected as without value actually is the great mountain that fills the whole earth. And that's what Yeshua told to Pilate. He says, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm. And he's making a point here. Until he dies, is resurrected, and is given the keys to death, hell, and the grave, why in the world would you want to go back in the garden? That's a fallacy. It's a foolish way of thinking, but these world leaders keep believing that it's possible. And that's who they believe Amraphel is, another name for Nimrod, trying one more time toward that motive, even though he was thwarted when the languages were confused. He hasn't forgotten Avram. And so Avram is said to have survived Nimrod's fiery furnace. And then we come forward in time, King Nebuchadnezzar attempts to replicate the Tower of Bavel. And he even heats up the furnace 7 times hotter, which means he's building up the wood, he's building up the fuel. And he throws the 3 Hebrew servants. But you have to remember who these men are. These are nobles. These were not captured. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and the billy goat, Abednego, they were not captured in war. The king gave them to keep Nebuchadnezzar off his back. He gave him some of his best young men. And it's not until a generation later that he comes back and destroys the city. And so these are nobles. But it may be that it was so easy for Nebuchadnezzar to access a furnace because it was the same furnace in which he had forged his image. Because it's described as a kiln. If you read a Jewish translation, it'll describe the furnace as a kiln, where he may have been making, again, bricks for that tower, or he could have been making his own image, or both. Kiln's a kiln. And so Nebuchadnezzar is trying to rekindle Babylonian history. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, I haven't read a lot about Saddam Hussein, but I think he even kind of grabbed a hold of this vision and was trying to rebuild some things. But Daniel interpreted Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And he acknowledges that Babylon is a golden kingdom. He's like, you got a great thing going on here, King Nebuchadnezzar. But it's not going to last. And the kingdoms that come after you will be progressively weaker until it's going to be a stone that crushes them all. And of course, Israel is seen as that stone. Messiah, we see Messiah also as that stone. And the king is thinking, well, does my kingdom really have to end? What if I can have the nobles from that kingdom that's supposed to destroy them all? What if I can cause them to bow down and worship my golden image? Because my image is entirely of gold. See, he's had the dream, but he still makes the image all of gold. He's like, it's going to be totally mine. And he gathers the peoples. If you read closely in Daniel, he's gathering peoples from all nations under his influence. We don't know if they knew what they were gathering to do, but they gathered. He's like, if I can get people from all nations, including these Hebrews, to bow down and worship my image, then my kingdom will last to all generations. And in Daniel 3:1-7, it tells where they set up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. That again, the area goes back to where the original Tower of Babel was built. It was the dedication of his golden image. And he says, oh, peoples, nations, and men of every language, to you the command is given. At the moment you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. And it says, when all the peoples heard, you hear this repetition of Nimrod being the second world ruler, and now Nebuchadnezzar, I'm going to be world ruler, so I need to gather all the people, so at least symbolically, I can prevail. And then it goes through again and lists every instrument. And when something's repeated, we pay attention. It says, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had set up. And there's a picture of the Ishtar, part of the Ishtar gate. And it was beautiful in its day, and they say that there was nothing like the processional of King Nebuchadnezzar at the New Year feast, when he would go through the streets of Babylon. They said there was just nothing that could duplicate it, except I've got a better idea. And so the size of the image, the golden image, is important. We know that he made it 6 by 60 cubits. If we look at what this these dimensions match. It matches the height of the side pillars of the temple. What's he trying to do? Duplicate the temple. We know that in the Song of Songs, chapter 3, verse 7, it says, behold, it is the traveling couch of King Solomon, 60 mighty men around it, of the mighty men of Israel. This in the Song of Songs is thought to describe the Ark of the Covenant, surrounded by 60 mighty men to protect it. So again, he's not only identifying himself with the temple, he's identifying himself even with the Ark of the Covenant and as a mighty man. And they said that from an engineering standpoint, an image of these dimensions would have never stood. Gold is too soft. And the weight-bearing part of it, it just wouldn't work. But there's a tradition that the gold of the temple was somehow supernatural because it couldn't have done the things that the scripture says it could if it were just an ordinary soft gold. But somehow these structures held together fine. And they say that from what he had demanded from the king that had given over, like Daniel and the others, he took some of that gold and built it as a foundation for his own image. And Daniel had even acknowledged, remember when Daniel's called in to interpret the dream? He says, you, O king, are the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. He's getting even Edenic language. Rule over the birds of the sky. You're going to rule over them all. He's putting him pretty much in the place of Adam. He's already telling King Nebuchadnezzar, he's given you gold. You've got it. That's great. But he says, you have to acknowledge who's given it to you. You are the King of kings only because the God of heaven gave it to you. And that's not enough for King Nebuchadnezzar. Now he wants to be the God of heaven. He doesn't want to be blessed by the God of heaven. He wants to be the God of heaven. And so why does he follow up by building a golden image to himself? What was going on there? Was that as great an event as we think? Or was that simply the king saying, oh, so that's God's playbook. Okay, now that you've given me the information, I know what to do. He's not really changing his mind. There's no repentance there. And so he still thinks he can circumvent this worldwide reign of Elohim. Because Daniel had told him in 244, in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all of these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. And so you can see Nebuchadnezzar's plan now. You can almost see him mapping it out or dictating it to a scribe or something. He's like, okay, we need to build an image, all of gold. We need to build another tower. This is how I'm going to acquire this kingdom without end. I've got to get all the people's representatives from every nation. I got to get these 3 Hebrew royals that represent the best of Jerusalem and Judah. I've got to get all these people in here to bow down to my golden image, and that way my empire will stay golden. And really, that's kind of what we all do in maybe a smaller scale, because I don't think if we sent out invitations for somebody to come bow to our image, they would come. But often our behavior demands it. We're demanding people bow down to our will and our own self-image. And that's why we have to be really careful when we teach kids about self-image, that we're not teaching them to make themselves an idol that others should worship. There's a fine line that parents have to walk right there, because an idol is really just how you see yourself. That's why they had so many. Just pick the one you like, that you identify with, or the one that you need something from. Worship that one. And no matter what kind of gold you dip it in, it's not going to be an everlasting kingdom. And so here's why that Tim might be interested in what it means for Nimrod to begin to be a mighty one. It says in 1 Chronicles 1:10, Cush became the father of Nimrod. He began, Hechel, in Hebrew, to be a mighty one in the earth. It comes from Chalal. And I picked out some of the usages there, of course, to profane. What is he doing? When he begins to be a mighty one, he begins to profane the plan of salvation, the plan of redemption that is already in motion at that point. To begin as if by an opening wedge. What's he trying to do? Wedge his way back into the garden. And then this is strange. It says to play the flute. And then pipe, player on instruments. There is something about apparently wind instruments that accompanies somebody who begins to be a mighty one in the earth. The music, remember twice, it was mentioned, you wait for the music. When you hear the music, and he lists all the instruments, but right here where it says Nimrod began, he began to open up this wedge. I build this tower, I can open the wedge into the heavens. And so that beginning of Nimrod, that's how Nebuchadnezzar imitates that. It's not like, okay, I just began, but I can bring the flutes in, and this is going to help me wedge open. And think about that in terms of the music we listen to. Is it wedging open something? Is it wedging open rebellion? Is it wedging open immorality? Is it wedging open self-worship? It can also mean to prostitute. And this, of course, Nimrod opens up spiritual prostitution by using idols, asking people to worship idols as part of his governing system. So the image that Nebuchadnezzar built was thought to have been built in the plain of Dura. And the sources here, I've got the long quote in the slide, but in a nutshell, it says that where he built his tower in his image points to a site near the famous ruins of Babylon, southwest of Baghdad and north of Hilla. You can still find that on a map. The place where Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were thrown into the flames. Tradition places the lion's pit into which Daniel was thrown near this area. It was where the Tower of Babylon was built. If it's a replay, it explains why it says Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell in, because they had to stack the wood up to a certain point, and the guards or the soldiers would have got them up there. They would have died from the flames, and therefore Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would have fallen in. And what's awesome, and a great place to finish up, the sages say, it's in the Talmud, Sanhedrin 92b says, on this day is the day that Ezekiel's dry bones were resurrected in the plain of Dura. And this is the famous two-stick prophecy of the mountains of Israel and Judah restored. That at the moment that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were cast into the fiery furnace, the Holy One said to Ezekiel, go revive the dead. And once Ezekiel revived them, the bones came and struck Nebuchadnezzar, that wicked man, in his face. And he was forced to say, how great are his signs and how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion is from generation to generation. And so he gives up at that point, apparently, his aspirations of becoming an everlasting world kingdom and world leader, and of penetrating into the heavens. However, I'm going to take exception to what we said about the processional of King Nebuchadnezzar each year at the New Year feasts, that there is something that does compete with it. And it's the Torah processional, the words of the Torah processional. every single Shabbat all around the world. And I know we didn't have our normal Torah processional today, but if you want to say this with me. There is none like you among the gods, O Lord, and there is nothing like your works. Your kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and your dominion is throughout all generations. The Lord reigns, the Lord has reigned, the Lord will reign forever and ever. The Lord will give strength unto his people. The Lord will bless his people with peace. Isn't that awesome? The same way that we take Balaam's words when he was trying to curse Israel. And it's become one of the most lovely blessings in the Siddur. In the same way, King Nebuchadnezzar's words, he was forced to admit that the generations of Elohim are throughout all generations. His dominion is throughout all generations. And every week, in every synagogue, that precedes the Torah scroll processional. As we walk the Torah scroll around every synagogue, to me, that is more glorious than anything I could have seen in King Nebuchadnezzar's processional through the streets of Babylon. Because what we have with the Torah is a promise of peace, not being subjugated under some man's dominion, but a kingdom of peace. And that's an awesome thing. That's an awesome thing, that you have a ruler who loves you and wants the best for you and wants you to prosper. And he has a plan because he doesn't want us to live eternally in sin, but he does want to restore us to the garden. I think that's a beautiful thing. And I don't know that you necessarily get that without the Midrash on this particular lesson, but once you kind of know a few points on the Midrash, it explains Lekh Lekha, the incident with Lot, why Avram had to be lured specifically to tell Dan. But it's also good news for us because we knew how the story of Nebuchadnezzar was going to end before we read it. And so I'd like to say thank you to those on the live stream who joined us. Appreciate you tuning in. And next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll be back. And it'll be at 4 p.m. Eastern next week. So you guys have a wonderful Shabbat. And appreciate your prayers for me last week. Please continue. Please continue, and I'll let you know when to stop. That's important, but it's not right now. So thank you, everybody. And thank you guys for being very patient while we have an extra congregation online here.
And isn't it interesting that during the appointed time in